Welcome to today's episode called Jesse Livermore, the best trader ever. I wanted to dig into Livermore's story ever since we came across him in the episode we did on short sellers, and what a story this is. He became a full-time trader at the age of 16. He built his own system that earned him billions in today's money. But so many times he didn't follow his own system and went broke and bankrupt. This is the guy who shorted the 1929 crash and made over $2 billion from it. It's a fascinating story. Enjoy. Jesse Livermore was born in 1877 in Massachusetts. They were poor. His father was a farmer. But Jesse was very, very smart. By the time he was 3, he could read and write. Now at 14, his father pulled him out of the farm to work. But Jesse wasn't made for the fields. And a year later, with his mother's blessing, he moved to Boston with $5 in his pocket and found a job as a board boy at Payne Weber's Boston office. And he was being paid $5 a week for chalking down stock quotes on a board as they came in from the ticker tape. Now, the ticker tape, it was the earliest electrical device that was dedicated to financial communications. It transmitted stock price information over telegraph lines, and it was in use from 1870 up to 1970. Livermore studied the tape and he noticed familiar sequences. Like he could recall how a stock's price movement one day foreshadowed its move the next. As he said, a battle goes on in the stock market and the tape is your telescope. So day after day, he started obsessively tracking these habits of stocks. He kept detailed notes on which of the ideas worked and which ones failed. Now, he also studied the customers and the brokers because he was fascinated by the way that they passed tips and rumours onto each other, which rarely appeared to work at all. And so what Livermore was doing at this time, and what he would continue to do throughout most of his lifetime, was work on his system. A system that wasn't based on rumour or instinct. It was a knowledge-based system, but one that also took human nature into account and put a huge emphasis on the human element. Because as Livermore wrote later in life, human nature never changes, and human nature runs the market. Not reason, not economics, and certainly not logic. It is our human emotions that drive the market, as they do most other things on this planet. So he started testing his method. He walked into a bucket shop. These were very popular at the time. There was loads of them in all these cities, and they were smoky gambling dens where anyone could bet on stock prices with tiny stakes. And his first trade was $5 on Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad stock. I mean, Quincy Railroad, I love the names of these old American companies. So the stock went up. He walked away with a profit of $3.12. I mean, small money, but it confirmed to Livermore that his method worked, so he was hooked. Every spare minute he went to the bucket shops, he started making more in a week than he earned in a month at Payne Weber. And his bosses got wind of his side hustle because Livermore was starting to make a name for himself. And they gave him an ultimatum: either quit the bucket shops or quit his job. He quit his job and became a full-time trader at just 16 years old. And pretty soon, he was pulling in about $200 a week. That's over $7,000 a week in today's money. And by the age of 20, he had a nest egg of over $10,000, about $400,000 in today's money, which was a fortune back then. But of course, bucket shops started getting wise to him, and they were banning him because his consistency, it was threatening their businesses. Livermore responded with disguises, caps pulled low, fake beards. It worked for a while, but his reputation spread too far, and by 1897, every bucket shop knew his face. He was effectively locked out. So he moved to New York and married a young woman named Nettie Jordan only a few weeks after knowing her. I mean, it was impulsive, but Livermore felt untouchable. But at that point, his system, it hadn't been fully formed, and over the next few years, he lost his fortune. He also lost Nettie. But he kept on studying the markets. He kept on refining his method. And in this system, he always started now with the broad market direction before drilling down into individual stocks. So his aim was to follow the line of least resistance. If he expected the overall market to rise, shorting the weakest stocks he could find made no sense at all. That was sailing straight into the wind. He also accepted that he would often be wrong, so he developed what he called a probing approach. He built positions gradually. If the market wasn't behaving the way he expected, that was a signal that he was wrong, and he would close out the trade. But if the market confirmed his view and moved in his favour, that was his cue to add to the position, because Livermore's position was that the market is always right, or to quote him, markets are never wrong, only opinions are. And these principles, and there were many more principles that he had, they became foundational. And by sticking to them, Livermore started to make money. In one trade over a 5-day period, he turned $10,000 into $50,000. That's over $2 million in today's money. So from 1901 to 1906, Livermore was doing very, very well for himself. Now, he'd often take breaks to recalibrate, and I'm guessing to relieve some of the stress, because trading is an extremely stressful business. But these breaks also were because Livermore suffered throughout his life from severe depression. Anyway, on one of these breaks to Atlantic City in 1906, he met a stock promoter who warned him about Union Pacific Railroad stock. He said it was too high, it was too stretched. And while Livermore's system was always against trading on tips or rumours or instinct, this time he said he felt a psychic surge, this gut-deep certainty that Union Pacific was about to crack. And now everyone around him thought that he'd lost it, because the stock had been climbing for months in a roaring bull market, and according to his own system, that made it a good time to buy. Betting against it looked insane, and as I said, it was totally against his system, but he telegraphed orders back to New York, and he said sell Union Pacific short, thousands of shares. He was on a huge losing streak with this trade. But then fate intervened. The San Francisco earthquake hit, and railroad stocks collapsed, and Livermore made a profit of $250,000, about $9 million in today's money. Now, Livermore, he knew that it was luck, and so he quickly pivoted back to his system, and over the coming 12 months, he studied the numbers, ignored any rumours, and what his system was telling him was that the market was now too high. You see, there was still a hangover from the San Francisco earthquake, because as the city began to rebuild, gold flowed out of the United States to pay foreign insurance claims. The outflow hit hard. The dollar was still tied to gold, so every ounce of gold that left the country meant a tighter money supply at home. And Livermore could see that less money in circulation meant less liquidity across the board. And so as far as he was concerned, the whole system was leaning towards a collapse. So he started shorting. And then came Thursday, October 24th, 1907, and this was called the Panic of 1907, and also called the Banker's Panic. Prices collapsed across the board. By the closing bell, Livermore was up about $1 million. That's over $35 million in today's money. At 30 years old, he had pulled off one of the biggest one-day gains of any trader. But the US financial system was hanging by a thread as a result of the panic. That night, JP Morgan summoned New York's banking elites to his library, locking the doors until they agreed to pool their resources and rescue the system. It's very reminiscent of the 2008 crash, when Hank Paulson and Timothy Geithner got all of the Wall Street head honchos together for a tense all-night meeting to hammer out a plan to save the banks. Anyway, that night in 1906, JP Morgan also sent a message to Livermore asking that he stop shorting. Now, Livermore had always admired and respected Morgan, and so not only did he stop shorting, he actually flipped his positions, started buying in large quantities, and by doing this, he helped turn the tide, because other traders noticed, and they reasoned, well, if Livermore was buying, maybe the worst was over. And coupled with Morgan's bank rescue, the panic began to ease. By the next day, stocks stabilised, and within a week, they were climbing again. And Livermore was held up as a hero. The press credited him with helping steady the market. Fellow traders who had followed his lead, they'd made fortunes out of it. He was celebrated as a stabiliser, someone who had put the market, the good of the country, above his own profits. But of course he was flush. He bought a yacht, a private rail car, a luxurious Manhattan apartment. He lived like a king. But then, just a year later, he broke his rules again. In 1908, he listened to a tip from Percy Thomas, known as the Cotton King. Now, Thomas had previously tried and failed to corner the cotton market, and Livermore had actually profited very handsomely from that incident. But Livermore respected Thomas's opinion, and so when Thomas insisted that cotton was headed higher, Livermore listened. And when the prices dropped, instead of taking a quick and small loss as per his system, Livermore instead continued to buy more. He lost a fortune and started trading manically to try and recoup his losses, but he ended up losing all of the money he had made from 1907. He had to sell his yacht, his apartment, and for the next several years he drifted. The market was stagnant, opportunities were scarce, his debts were mounting. He later described it as starvation. Now, as already mentioned, Livermore suffered from depression throughout his life, and as a result, during this time, he endured a complete emotional breakdown. By early 1915, he declared bankruptcy. The New York Times ran a headline that said, "Jesse Livermore loses millions he made on Wall Street." So the public spectacle, as you can imagine, it was brutal. But in Livermore's own mind, it was a release, because bankruptcy wiped the slate clean, and significantly, and I think very significantly, he also promised all of his creditors that he'd repay them in full. So a friend of his, who ran a brokerage, opened an account for Livermore and gave him just enough margin to buy 500 shares. So a tiny account for a man who had made millions. Livermore didn't touch the account for weeks. He simply sat and studied the tape, waiting. And one company kept drawing his eye, Bethlehem Steel, because World War I was raging at this stage and demand for steel was increasing. He bought 500 shares, and within months he had turned it to $150,000 profit, just under $5 million in today's money. So a remarkable turnaround. By 1917 he had built his fortune back, and he fulfilled his promise to his creditors, paying every one of them back 100%. And then, in late 1918, he went back into cotton, but this time not in a tip. This time he was using his system, and he was so successful that he cornered the cotton market. Now, to explain briefly, cornering a market means gaining enough control over the supply of a particular asset that you could influence its price. So, when Livermore cornered the cotton market by buying up most available contracts, he created scarcity, meaning that then he could, of course, sell at higher prices. But he was so successful in this case that he got a call from President Woodrow Wilson personally asking that he unwind his position, release cotton back into the market. Livermore agreed. He sold out at break even, no profit, no loss. And when the president asked him why he even tried to corner the market in the first place, Livermore replied, "To see if I could, Mr. President." Because to him, speculation, it wasn't only about money. It was a test, a game of nerves and wits. Now, that same year, at the age of 41, he married Dorothy Went, a glamorous 22-year-old showgirl, and their wedding was a huge society event. They moved into a mansion in Long Island, and Dorothy spent freely, jewels, furs, redecorating at will, and they had 2 sons, but the marriage was strained pretty quickly because Dorothy drank heavily and Livermore kept mistresses. He was always a big womanizer. In 1922, Livermore got involved in one of Wall Street's strangest episodes, the Piggly Wiggly affair. Now, we mentioned this in our episode on short selling. So Clarence Saunders was the founder of the nation's first self-service grocery chain called Piggly Wiggly, and he wanted revenge on short sellers who believed the company was overvalued. And so he brought Livermore in to help, and together they tried to corner the market, buying up shares and pushing the price from $40 to over $100. In March 1923, Saunders triggered the squeeze, demanding delivery of borrowed shares. Short sellers had 24 hours to meet the demand, and the stock price surged to $124. It looked, to all intents and purposes, like Saunders had won. But then the exchange stepped in. I'm going to do an episode on this because it's a fascinating story. So the exchange stepped in, trading was suspended, and the short sellers were given more time, so the corner collapsed, and Saunders was ruined. But Livermore, sensing trouble, he had exited early and kept his profits. Then in 1924 came one of Livermore's biggest and most profitable trades. On the one side was Arthur Cotton. He was a giant in the grain trade and he was very bullish on wheat. Now Livermore was initially bullish as well. But on March 13, 1925, while Cotton had taken the day off, Livermore changed sides and together with another large trader, Thomas Howell, he began selling wheat contracts in huge quantities. Livermore and Howell, get this, made $22 million in profit, just under $500 million, an astronomical sum in 1925. Rumours swirled that Livermore had timed the attack precisely for when Cotton was away, that he and Howell had planned this all along, and the Secretary of Agriculture ordered an investigation, but there was no proof. And while Livermore emerged from the Piggly Wiggly and the wheat trade affairs financially stronger, he did get a reputation as a behind-the-scenes manipulator. But, of course, that didn't and doesn't really matter on Wall Street. As we know, on Wall Street, nothing succeeds like success. And by the mid-1920s, Livermore was a very powerful and much respected trader. His standing was such that even rumours of his trades could move prices. But what should be noted is that Livermore didn't court attention. He actually hated it. And to protect himself, he moved his operation into a fortress-like office in Manhattan's Squibb building. And the setup was as tight as a vault. There was a single guarded door, phones that only dialed out, clerks and traders were sworn to silence, and during trading hours, no one went in or out. He didn't want Wall Street guessing what he was up to. And there was another good reason why Livermore hated the attention. It made him and his family targets for criminals, as happened in 1927, when a notorious thief named Boston Billy, together with his gang, broke into Livermore's mansion, brandishing pistols, forcing Livermore, Dorothy, their children and servants to the floor. The intruders, they ransacked the house, they stole over $100,000 in jewels and cash. Throughout the ordeal, Livermore, he stayed calm and the robbers left without harming anyone. But Dorothy, who was already a heavy drinker, she spiraled further. By 1928, whispers were spreading that the marriage was in trouble. And it not only due to Dorothy's drinking, but also because Livermore continued with his womanizing ways. But throughout all of this, Livermore never lost focus on the markets. And for some context, the markets throughout the 1920s in the US, they had been on a non-stop bull run. There were many reasons for this bullishness. Post-World War I, America emerged as an industrial giant. They had a wave of new technologies. You had radios, household appliances, and of course, the motor car, which in itself, it was reshaping not just the economy, but also the society. And you had to have new roads, gas stations, motels, roadside cafes. America was booming and consumer credit was easy. So people took advantage. Not just the wealthy. Millions and millions of ordinary Americans were buying goods they couldn't afford and investing money they didn't have in the stock exchange. And regulation was pretty thin. And the result was one of the most explosive bull markets in history. Everyone believed the good times would last forever. Everyone except Livermore. He lived through a few manias. He knew the signs. And quietly, he began placing bets against the market. He spread his trades across more than 100 brokerage accounts, so no one could actually see what he was doing. Nobody could grasp the full scale of his position. And piece by piece, he built a mountain of short sales. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The ticker tape was backed up for hours as orders came flooding in. Prices were collapsing. On the trading floor, brokers screamed themselves hoarse. Fortunes evaporated in minutes. And Livermore's short bets paid off on a staggering scale. When the dust had cleared, he had made roughly $100 million, about $2 billion in today's money. Now, understandably, the public and the press, they turned against him. He was portrayed as the man who had seen it coming and who had profited from a national disaster. Angry letters poured in, death threats. He had to hire bodyguards just to move around New York. And through 1930 and 1931, the Depression deepened. the Dow Jones kept sliding down and down until it erased almost 90% of its value. And for someone like Livermore, who thrived on trading, this relentless fall of the stock market, it was a nightmare. Of course, he could have just stopped trading, held on to his huge fortune, but that wasn't in his makeup. And even worse, he used leverage, so he was borrowing to amplify his positions, and the market, it just kept punishing him. His fortune began to shrink. As he said himself about his relationship with money, it isn't the making of it, it's the keeping it that's hard. And now at home, things were even worse. In 1932, Dorothy was granted a divorce. She walked away with 10 million in cash, custody of their sons and the Long Island mansion. And not long after, she sold the mansion. Now, this mansion had cost more than $3.5 million to build and to furnish. And at auction, in the middle of the Great Depression, it sold for only $222,000. And soon after, it was demolished, which devastated Livermore. Professionally, he retreated. He shut down his fortress-like office, and by late 1932, just 3 years after making almost $2 billion, Livermore was running out of money. He was divorced. He was fading. But it wasn't all bad news. In 1933, he married Harriet Metz Noble. She was an Omaha socialite from a wealthy brewing family. She was 38, cultured, financially secure, and by all accounts, they were a very happy couple. But then in 1934, Roosevelt's New Deal introduced the Securities Exchange Act, created the SEC, and introduced sweeping reforms. And when Livermore read the fine print, it hit him hard. He knew what these meant. The laws seemed written with men like him in mind. As he later wrote, almost every method I used to amass 4 fortunes was now illegal. So his trading faltered. He second-guessed himself constantly. He'd lost his confidence and his touch. And in March 1934, unable to meet his obligations, he filed for bankruptcy again, with liabilities of about $2.5 million and assets of just $84,000. The man who had made $100 million 5 years earlier was once again broke. And there was more bad news to come. Thanksgiving 1935, Dorothy, Livermore's ex-wife, was hosting dinner at her mansion with her sons Jesse Jr., Paul, her new husband, and a few friends. Dorothy, of course, had been drinking heavily, and 16-year-old Jesse Jr. had had enough and he snapped. He got drunk, got into a huge row with Dorothy, and culminated in him getting a gun and dared her to shoot him. And she did. Jesse Jr. was rushed to hospital in critical condition. Now, this was huge news. Back in New York, Livermore heard the news himself on the trading floor. He flew to California with Harriet and he was pacing the hospital corridors, chain smoking, and he said, "If my boy dies, I'll spend every cent I have to see that she gets what's coming to her," referring, of course, to Dorothy. However, Jesse Jr. survived, and from his hospital bed he took the blame. He said, "It was all my fault, it was an accident," and that statement kept his mother out of prison. The charges were dropped. For Livermore, the next few years brought only more decline. By the late 30s, he was only doing very small trades and seemed detached. Now, financial pressure wasn't his main concern anymore. Yes, he had lost his fortune, but Harriet's fortune kept them comfortable. They lived in a Park Avenue apartment. They spent time in Chicago, vacationed abroad. But the fight had gone out of him. He had had so many battles, professional and personal. He suffered from depression. And also, I think, the changes brought in after the crash were just the final blow. He couldn't summon up the energy or the will to remodel his system to accommodate these new regulations. Still, he made one last attempt at relevance. In 1939, he began writing a book, How to Trade in Stocks. It was part memoir, part manual, a codification, I suppose, of his market rules. The book came out in March 1940, but sales were poor. The world was preoccupied with World War II, and Livermore's methods, which were rooted in a bygone era, they seemed outdated. He was crushed because he had hoped the book would restore his name. And despite the lukewarm reception to the book, its principles have echoed through the decades of trading conventions. It remains one of the earliest and most enduring manuals that treats trading as a disciplined craft, not purely gambling. But by the fall of 1940, Livermore's depression deepened. He withdrew into himself, convinced that his career was over and his legacy tarnished. On November 27, 1940, Livermore and Harriet went to the Stork Club in Manhattan. They dined, listened to music. A photographer approached for a picture. Livermore obliged, but added with this cryptic remark, "It's the last picture you'll take because tomorrow I'm going away for a long time." The next day, he walked into the Sherry Netherland Hotel. He sat at the bar, drank 2 cocktails, and scribbled in a notebook. At 4:30 p.m, he stepped into the cloakroom. Moments later, a gunshot echoed. Livermore had killed himself. In his pocket was an 8-page note addressed to Harriet, including the lines, "Can't help it. Things have been bad with me. I'm tired of fighting. I'm unworthy of your love. I am a failure. This is the only way out." Livermore was 63. It was a tragic end, but I think I do Livermore a disservice by portraying his life as simply a tragedy, some sort of moral tale where I can sermonise about how he had all the money in the world but was never happy, about how he couldn't help himself but continue to bet, to trade, and lose his fortune time and time again, about his womanising, his chaotic personal life. All that is true, definitely, and we can learn lessons from it. And there's no getting away from the fact that Livermore suffered from severe depression throughout his life at a time where people just didn't talk about those things and there was no treatment, and this had a huge negative impact throughout his life. But I also want to celebrate his achievements. Livermore is believed by many to be among the very best traders ever. He was a maverick, an out-and-out individual who created a trading system not just based on numbers, but also took into account human nature, human frailties. He was a remarkable man in terms of his trading achievements, and it's such a pity that he ended his life believing himself to be a failure. His was such a dramatic life, and that's why the story of Jesse Livermore is such a great business story. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story that you'd like us to cover, email us at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.